Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Leading Health Systems Network webinar. It's the first LHSN webinar of 2021. And LHSN, as many of you know, is a collaborative network of healthcare leaders and organizations dedicated to improving healthcare delivery within the institute, based within the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College London. And I'm very pleased that today we're hosting Dr. Saif Abed, Partner and Director of Cybersecurity Services for the AbedGraham Group, and Mr. Arvind Sivaramakrishnan, who's the Chief Information Officer of Apollo Hospitals Enterprise Limited, based in India, but has a worldwide reach, as we all know from Apollo. Just a few introductory remarks about both Saif and Arvind. Saif is a medical doctor and health cybersecurity national security expert. His primary fields of specialization are cyber warfare and crime targeting hospitals and safety critical infrastructure. Based in London, Dr. Abed is a partner and director of cybersecurity services at the Clinical Security and Advisory and Technology Services Organization, the AbedGraham Group. He also holds independent expert roles and accreditations for the European Commission, the WHO, and the UK Infrastructure and Projects Authority. Holds degrees in medicine and management and software and systems from universities in the UK. Arvind is the Chief Information Officer at Apollo Hospitals Enterprise Limited, India, and is based out of Chennai in India. He is responsible for the IT strategy and implementation across the whole of Apollo Hospitals Group. Arvind has extensive experience in management consulting, architecting, and building solutions for enterprise-wide applications. He also leads the digital transformation initiatives at Apollo Hospitals Group. His experience in the domain of healthcare IT has scanned geographies across the world, and prior to his current assignment, he was with the healthcare practice of Computer Sciences Corporation in Michigan, USA. The format of today's session will be two 15-minute presentations, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of time for questions. We hope this is going to be a conversation led by Saif and Arvind, but we really want you to join in because we want to learn from your experiences as well. And we really want to build a community through this webinar of people interested in this topic. And this will be a topic that has been already trailed through some publications coming from Imperial, and we want to continue on that process. Can I ask you all to ensure that your camera is turned off and your microphone is muted? And if you'd like to ask the speakers any questions based on their presentations during the webinar, please type these in the usual way in the chat box, or you could use anonymously direct to Nikki O'Brien. The person behind all this is Nikki O'Brien, and Nikki has worked very hard to set this webinar up. As you know from our previous work on the LHSN over the last 2 years or so, Nikki has led our work and organization structure. So I also need to thank Nikki for setting our webinar up. With all that said, I'm now pleased to hand over to Dr. Saif Abed to begin the webinar, and he will now take us straight to his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. I hope you can see the screen that I'm sharing, and hopefully we'll be good to go. So I think, first of all, I just want to thank all the different organizations who've put this fantastic webinar together. Imperial College, the Imperial College London, the Institute of Global Health Innovation. This is a really timely topic. And you'll see that from the title that I have abridged, I've really augmented it slightly. Instead of using the phrase to discuss specifically medical devices, I want to discuss what we call understanding medical IoT security, because IoT is really the buzz phrase, if you will, that has taken center stage over the last few years. The Internet of Things, whether it's consumer devices in your home, all the way through to safety critical infrastructure such as healthcare, the biggest security challenges today are in this field. And in my work at the AbedGraham Group, whether it's working with government agencies around the world or healthcare providers or large tech companies themselves, one of the things that we are finding is that the ability to grapple with how medical devices are now part of this IoT ecosystem is a real challenge. So what I'd like to achieve over the next 10 to 15 minutes is a really quick outline of how we define these devices, what are the problems that they are presenting, and then go through one version of how we can address medical IoT security. Then I'll go through a brief example of a health system that we worked with in the UK and how we addressed the challenge with them. So what is medical IoT? What is the Internet of Things? You'll see a lot of different buzz phrases when it comes to this area. You'll hear IoT by itself, you'll hear medical IoT, you'll hear IOMT, the Internet of Medical Things. You'll also hear OT as a separate buzz phrase. For me, you know, as a medical doctor by background, I've had to deal with enough jargon in my life. I don't need more complex jargon. So let's just simplify it down and let's just call it medical IoT and look at what it means. So first, in its simplest form, it's taking devices, medical devices in this instance, that could function by themselves without needing any connection to a hospital network or a home network or effectively the internet to function. But for whatever reason, we have decided to add network connectivity, internet connectivity to that device. And that's really interesting. In the past year, if you think about the pandemic, it could be something like someone's insulin pump that we have decided in order to empower patients, we've added network connectivity as a feature in order to transmit real-time information to a patient app that then goes to a cloud-based service. That means their healthcare professional can connect with them and view their data as well. Or it can be something like a diagnostic imaging device, such as a CT scanner or an MRI scanner in a hospital. And we've added network and internet connectivity potentially to that device so that engineers can remotely check on the status of that device. But at its simplest form, taking medical IoT at face value, the first step is basically giving network or internet connectivity as a feature of that device. But then the next layer is where we start straddling into what's described as OT. And that's where you have a given device and you want to monitor it in real time in terms of its precise behavior. And that's where you're adding sensors to that device that monitor everything from its utilization rate, its temperature, its the factors to do with its motherboard, the firmware, the hardware capabilities, everything you can think of being monitored in a granular way. That's the next level. And the best example to think of typically is aviation. An airplane, a modern day airplane, like an Airbus, has so much technology monitoring every single component and how it's functioning. That's really the first great example of this evolution of IoT, or what's considered OT as well. And that's happening in healthcare more and more. You're seeing both simple and complex medical devices being monitored in a very granular way. And that presents a new level of importance of this IoT ecosystem in terms of making sure healthcare systems can function effectively. But then an area that's often missed is all the surrounding infrastructure that's needed to make sure that medical devices continue to function in an effective way. So you don't just think about the diagnostic imaging device. You have to think about the servers, the routers, the switches that are transmitting all that critical clinical information all around the hospital to the other endpoints that want to process and view and analyze the data that's being generated. It's about, for example, if we stick to diagnostic imaging for a moment, it's about the PACS system. It's about the server that's hosting the medical imaging data. It's about the way that that part of a hospital is segmented. So one thing I always remind people is when you think of medical IoT, always segment your thoughts to the wider ecosystem. So what's the problem with this? Well, first of all, we have to talk about people and processes, not just technology. First of all, one of the things we have to consider is the vast majority of hospitals in the world do not have a clear view of the inventory of their devices. And in particular, let's be clear, they're devices that are networked just internally, let alone the ones that are exposed to the internet. So that's problem number one. The next stage is most hospitals around the world do not have a clear process for not just identifying risks, but defining risks, managing them, understanding why risks are important or not. How do you prioritize a risk? Is it because of the impact to patient safety potentially, or is it because of financial impact to an organization? There are many ways to classify and categorize risk, and that's a process that a lot of hospitals haven't reached yet, which we'll address shortly. And next one is a communication issue. And communication is a huge problem because the world of medical device security or medical IoT security really sits in a number of areas in terms of responsibility. Typically, when you think of medical devices, you think of clinical engineering or biomedical engineering as being responsible for these devices. And this department has a relationship with the medical device manufacturers and any other third parties managing their environment. But that's not necessarily a security-focused department. But on the other side, you have the IT department of a hospital that has a security responsibility. Yet they're not typically responsible for the medical device and IoT ecosystem. And on top of this, executive management, the boardroom of a health system, that is not a technical environment. They want to understand the risk profile of their organization, but they have very little communication with clinical engineering or IT security. And so there isn't a clear pathway of not only how do we identify risk, how do we communicate it in a way that uses business language so we can get the right resources we need to address the issues that we're identifying. The final one when it comes to medical devices is that too often there's a very strong dependency on the manufacturers and other third parties to identify and resolve risks, identify, to distribute patches, for example. And that's really problematic because a lot of medical devices, their vulnerabilities cannot be patched away. It requires compensating controls to be applied. And so that dependency on the manufacturers is really challenging. And so let's take it down to its final level. The more devices that are connected to a network, the greater surface area to attack and to spread an attack to lead to these really terrible, for example, ransomware attacks that can take down an entire hospital. And also many medical devices are just simply riddled with vulnerabilities that haven't been identified, haven't been qualified in terms of their risk profile, and haven't been mitigated. So what can we do about it? So in a really simplistic way, there is a clear process that can be approached here that has a few nuances for today's world of healthcare security. First step, you can't protect what you can't see. So step one has to be to conduct an inventory of your network assets. You can either do that kind of as a manual process, which can be very tedious and laborious, or you can use automated technologies to do that. The next level, and this is the area that we really specialize in, is analyzing and understanding the precise workflow context and function of a device. Before you even consider its security element, you have to understand, if this device fails, what does it mean for the clinical workflow it immediately sits in? And what does that mean for all the other workflows that are dependent on that device and its core workflow? So if a CT scanner that is located next to an emergency room fails, that failure isn't just for the emergency room. It affects patient flow to the medical wards, to surgical wards. It can affect how patients are identified to go to theater, for example, and many other issues. So that level of contextualization is a really critical element that's traditionally been missing in security, and especially for healthcare. Only then do you identify the vulnerabilities. And then when you have a precise understanding of the context and the vulnerabilities, can you really take a look at what is the business impact of the vulnerabilities in our organization? And that's from a patient safety perspective, it's from a clinical service perspective, and then based on that, financial and regulatory resiliency perspective as well. And why that's critical is it allows you to take the conversation up a level from just being a technical conversation about patching and really metrics that aren't as helpful in healthcare as they used to be, such as CVSS, which is, a good technical metric, but it's not contextualized. So you want to go beyond that and look at these business metrics instead. But by doing that, you can now have a conversation at an executive management level. You're, instead of talking about security, you're now talking about risk. You can get executive engagement and you can get additional resources and support to do what you need to do to protect a hospital and its ecosystem and therefore its patients. And then the final step is you have to take action. And then you repeat this process and you repeat it regularly and you repeat it with clear channels of communication across your organization. And as we enter the last few minutes of the presentation, I want to take you through a brief example of some work that we have done. We work all over the world, but recently we worked with a hospital system in the UK. It's a hospital system that had 3 hospitals as a part of its management, and their chief information officer and chief information security officer had a very clear question that they asked that they wanted to resolve. So what they wanted to do is to get better control of their IOMT ecosystem. They wanted to have a clear perspective of all the devices in their environment. But the key question they wanted answered is not just at a technical level, what are the vulnerabilities? They wanted to understand in a quantified way, what is the risk profile of our organization in terms of patient safety and in terms of the disruption of our clinical services because of the state of our IT environment. So what we did with them, working with a couple of other companies, we deployed what we describe as medical grade sensor technology in their environment so that we can identify all the devices and all their attributes and how they're behaving, especially from a technical perspective. That information then went to a platform that we have at our organization that we provide healthcare providers called CCOM Squared, which analyzes all that data and ranks assets and vulnerabilities based on their risk to patient safety and clinical services. And what we could then do is by identifying all these assets, all these vulnerabilities, and ranking them based on these very healthcare specific metrics, we could identify some really clear trends and risks in their organization that they could immediately start to address. And what was interesting about this is that the risks were not confined purely to the medical devices you could imagine. We identified risks coming from printers that were network connected, fax machines, servers, lots of network infrastructure that was vulnerable. We found risks that could easily be connected from a medical device all the way back through to their electronic medical record system. It was a really fascinating engagement, and it immediately generated a lot of recommendations that could be actioned, and it generated a process that could be acted on a regular basis. Those recommendations ultimately empowered the CIO and the CISO and gave them an ability to speak to a much wider audience. It allowed them to speak to their clinical leadership, to their executive management leadership about risk and about how cybersecurity is a patient safety issue. And so that's a very quick overview of one example of how we've approached this problem. And I believe I'm now approaching the 14-minute out of 15-minute mark. So I'm going to give back 1 minute to you, Mike, and to Arvind to start the next presentation. And I'll stop sharing there. My contact details are there. And of course, I'm happy to take questions at the end of this session.
Great. Thank you very much, Saif. That was a real tour de force. And thank you for the graphics, which were well displayed and really understandable. So I'd like, without further ado, hand over to India to take us through our next presentation. So I think Arvind has now got the screen. So great. Okay, over to you, Arvind, and we'll carry on. And thank you to David Grayson, who started the chat. So thank you for the first questions that's come through, and I'm sure we'll have more as Arvind speaks. So thank you very much. Over to you, Arvind. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Namaste. I hope all of you are doing well, and I hope all of you are doing keeping as energetic and enthusiastic as we can in this climate that's around all of us. So greetings to all of you and good wishes and good health to everyone. Thank you to the Imperial College and the Wish Foundation for having me on this discussion today. Let's get to the basics. Why are we doing this conversation? Let's get to the heart of what is the healthcare ecosystem. It's the patient. And in today's world of technology coupled with experience and expertise, there is a strong need to create this interconnected and seamless ecosystem, which is optimized, sustainable, and extremely high performing. Because that's what we as a consumer are expecting today. And health is a very, very personal topic. And when it comes to my health, I want nothing but the best of the best, wherever it is, however it is, to be made available to me. This is, all of us share this expectation, and all of us are justified in sharing this expectation. It's a problem when you go to the other side and say, how can the consumer make this unjustified? So that's when you're playing the other side of the table. But truth be told, all of us are customers, and all of us want this. And in healthcare today, almost everything is getting into a combination of medical technology and information technology deeply coupled. So no longer it is a device versus a rest of the workflow, process flow question. It's always going to be a coupled conversation. That means that software induced, software run device management. And device management in almost every specialty, subspecialty, that ensures that when the patient is presenting a symptom, you have the ability for speed to diagnosis by completely interconnecting the ecosystem of the aspect of care providing. With that said, all these buzzwords that you see splashed on the screen are things that we deal with. IoT, Internet of Things, Dr. Saif told us, Internet of Medical Things, you know what, Internet of Everything. And that's what we're dealing with. And that coupled with big data, that means that the data that is being captured, systematically analyzed, and presented back into the medical device at point of care, calibrated towards the event that is being discussed, and that hosted so that it is sustainable and accessible, because accessibility in healthcare is huge. With all of that said, look at some hard reality, and these are all that I did was I just went in yesterday. I just did cybersecurity and Indian healthcare. That's all I did. I just went to Google. I just put in the Google search, and these were the top things that came in. It's just a splash of the top headlines. 7 million cyber attacks, hospitals in India to prevent cyber theft, 45% spike in e-viruses, how Indian healthcare industry can protect itself against cyber threats. Looks like I don't have anything nice to speak. This is some hard reality. Healthcare, devices, data in devices, and the data in devices is volumes. And today, it is said that data is oil. The new oil, the new economy is data. We can have a separate discussion on whether we believe it or not, but it is true that the data is being used for highly effective decision making and highly effective manipulation of decision making. So if I present the information to you in a certain manner, you would be inclined to make some sort of a decision. And if I twist that piece of information, something wrong can happen, and that can be done willfully. And when we are looking at medical devices coupled with information technology at the point of care in health delivery, this combination is very powerful. So it's not an isolated conversation on whether it should be medical devices. It's not an isolated conversation on information technology and cybersecurity. All this has to be taken into one platform, and a discussion of totality is an absolute essential. And in today's world, every specialty, subspecialty has got a very complex imaging device that aids diagnosis. This basically helps in ensuring that the plan of care can be reached as fast as possible. Look at the situations we are facing today. The pandemic is rampant, and the moment you get a patient into a CT scan, you can quickly check how bad the lungs are affected or not. Couple that with AI and ML algorithms on how to read a lung or a chest CT, gives you the ability to ensure that mistakes are less, quality is improved, and ensuring that all put together, the clinical outcomes expected out of that medical imaging, medical device, information technology into that point of care of the clinical encounter is built towards a speed to diagnosis, a faster pace towards a care protocol, reducing or minimizing or even to the extent of completely eliminating mistakes. And all of this is prone to cyber threats, is prone to willful, malicious changes. And when those willful, malicious changes are happening is where you see cyber threats coming. Whether it was done, and that's why you're looking at how hospitals can prevent cyber theft and medjacking. We've heard the word hijacking, and now the new word medjacking is getting invented. And what is the impact of all these digital technologies on the healthcare providers? You have economic impacts, regulatory impacts, legal impacts. And then on the other side, you have socio-cultural impacts, geopolitical impacts, all making an environment, a wholesome environment that is mixed between technology and the overall environment, between the doctors, the consumers, the insurance or the payers, the partners to healthcare, the devices, and government. And when I say government, I'm talking law of the land. There's a monumental impact of technology on providers, and there is a high demand for quality and lower cost of healthcare from the patients. There's a high expectation of patient empowerment, and at the same time, for the providers, there is data influence on human behavior. There is an explosion of data that will reshape the efficacy of diagnoses. There is the demand for the enterprise agility that ensures that the patients get a very curated experience. Friends, I'm taking this conversation in a wholesome manner so that devices is not looked at in isolation. If you look at my screen here, you're looking at devices being one part of the technology enablement. But this device, when coupled with the consumer and economic reality, with insurance and regulatory impact, with geopolitical circumstances and government regulations, with partners who are socio-economic and legal, now you see that devices coupled with information technology into this new area of what we call health IT is wholesome, where the impact of cybersecurity is huge. That takes me into how do we look at mitigating and getting to this. And here the line between cyber security and privacy is very thin. And many a times these are interoperable words. Somebody with a strict definition will completely disagree with me. But let's look at what we're dealing with and the subject of cybersecurity on devices in terms of how do we prevent all of this. And that means touching it at the core. That means privacy by design. It has to be embedded into your DNA. Unless you have immunity in your DNA, any pandemic will really rock the complete system out. Incidentally, all of us are going through that. It's about taking a user-centric approach with a transparency. It is about valuing privacy at the same time protecting and preventing breaches. It is about ensuring that we avoid false dichotomies. And it is about the full life cycle of protection. All of this in totality is how you're looking at the entire scheme of cybersecurity coupled with medical devices at point of care, enabling powerful evidence-based pathways and protocols brought into devices at point of care for diagnosis that guide effective evidence-based techniques, evidence-based care processes, evidence-based protocols, ultimately teaming together to have delightful clinical outcomes. And all of this is severely jeopardized by how we look at cybersecurity coming in together, and cybersecurity coming in together so that these can be manipulated. As a last closing remark in terms of what's going on in India, there are huge regulations that the government is looking at in terms of the Personal Data Protection Bill, which is being tabled in the Parliament of India, that ensures that data is being looked at in a holistic manner, irrespective of how it is generated. And obviously devices is a very, very important part. Adhering to standards, whichever be the standard of the ISO, adhering to those standards and communicating between systems in standardized manner, be it the HL7 or the FHIR, or in coding techniques that are ICD or SNOMED, talking in jargons and lexicons that are understandable and interoperable, are ways by which you can look at governing this whole ecosystem of knowledge. And by that governance and by that constant training, can't look at it enough, embedded by privacy in the design aspect, making privacy and cybersecurity as part of the DNA, we are looking at this wholesome environment of cybersecurity devices and healthcare governed by software, powered by technology at point of care, not forgetting that we are dealing with human beings that need the ultimate human touch and the tender loving care. And that's how all of this comes together. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to interacting with all of you now.
Great, thank you very much, Arvind. That was again a really great presentation, and one that challenges us, I think, on many different fronts. As Saif and Arvind, you've both done that for us. I'm particularly interested in that balance that you both struck between the user and the patient and the services within which the system works. And you both talk a little bit, or slightly different elements, but this idea of standardization, of training, of developing a shared taxonomy, that's the word I would use probably, that we all understand and speak the same language, is we're really, it seems to be at the forefront of that at the moment, because we've been driven to it by the threats that have emerged by the various approaches into systems, but we haven't really started to develop a global process for sharing and learning together. And I'm just wondering if you mentioned training, Arvid. A previous Prime Minister in the UK used the phrase education as a real catchphrase for him. So I'm just wondering from both of you what your thoughts are on, before we go to specific questions, your thoughts are on the development of a global approach to taxonomy framework, a framework for training. What would your thoughts be on that? Because I know this is also very uniquely important to all healthcare systems, but all healthcare systems haven't necessarily got the funding and resources to employ, very highly cost-effective but very expensive technicians and leaders. So, Saif, over to you first, and then Arvind. Thank you.
Sure. I think one of the things, unfortunately, we have to consider is that cybersecurity is a relatively young subject matter area. And healthcare cybersecurity really has only become a thing in the last 5 years. Sure, in the US, there's the trend of data breaches for insurance companies, but it wasn't really until the WannaCry attack where cybersecurity hit the headlines. So when you talk about language and standardization, for any new subject, it can be very dense and very inaccessible. And that's something we have to change as healthcare and security leaders to make it accessible. And frankly, the first step to doing that is having people from different disciplines and different backgrounds in the hospital, in government, in tech companies, actually sitting in a room together, virtually or actually in person, hopefully, eventually. Because unless we first start talking to each other, we won't achieve that standardization. And it's even elements like Arvind mentioned. He said there's going to be the difficult person who segments privacy from security. I would be one of those people, for example. But Arvind and I would completely agree, I would suggest 99%, about how to tackle all the issues. But we have maybe slightly different interpretations of language and how things should be segmented. But until we meet and talk about it, how can we standardize a unified approach? So I'm not giving a perfect answer here, but I'm saying that the first step is we need to actually sit in the room together and talk if we want to achieve this standardization.
So that's definitely going to be one of our aims after this webinar, is how do we plan to do that and have some conversations, but in real time. I think as soon as we possibly can, given current circumstances. Arvind, any your thoughts on this subject?
The way I would look at it also is looking at creating a common minimum. See, at some point we always get very enthusiastic and start dwelling into the depth of it, trying to cover into as much kind of intelligence that is possible in that particular area. But then what is required really across the industry is for the left hand to appreciate what's going on in the right hand. And today that appreciation is minimal, thereby people relegating the whole aspect of cybersecurity and privacy as something that will be taken care by the IT teams. Oh, that's something IT, and they'll take care of it and they'll make it go. So security and privacy and the whole process of building processes, whether those processes are automated, semi-automated, or nudged at a point of service, whatever be the method of bringing it, including, I wouldn't mind if there's a breach on privacy, if there's a big bell that can keep ringing so that it embarrasses you. I wouldn't mind doing that too. But whatever be the process, I think a common minimum is required, and we must do a lot to put it into the curriculum of all medical education right at that stage, irrespective of the nature of curriculum. Whether it's nursing or medical or paramedics or technicians, whatever be the name, and also to the technologists, bringing everybody into it. And that case, the appreciation for the problem statement is much more. Just like Dr. Saif said, until WannaCry hit the world, the appreciation for the magnitude of the problem was probably not there. Probably things bigger than the WannaCry were happening before that. But it was just, so I would say, create this as a movement. Only then we'll be able to build it into the DNA. It's everybody's thought, everybody's action, everybody's attention required, not just a bunch of thought leaders and academics trying to come up with a structure. I think we need to move beyond that stage.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you. Well said. I'm sure many will agree with you on that call. And you've just reminded me also that we are currently on another piece of work that we're doing, which some have been involved with, is in developing the next curriculum guide for patient safety for WHO. This is 10 years since the last one, and this hopefully we'll be producing this over the next few months. And cybersecurity will be an issue, I think, and training and identifying needs for that. So we'll come back to you both, I think, for some words of wisdom that we can include in that work. Now, I do have a couple of questions from participants, but there's one from an old friend from New Zealand, David Grayson, who's a leading light in our work on the LHSN from New Zealand. David, I'm not sure whether you can unmute, and maybe you could ask your question yourself if that's going to be possible for you, because it's a very interesting question. I'll read it out, but it may be if you can unmute, you might be able to speak to it. I don't know if Nikki can let you unmute. So the question is the relative risk for IT security greater for devices compared to humans in the loop, i.e. human interactions via email, etc.? Of the recent ransomware attacks, how many have been via devices rather than other modes of attack? David, are you online? Are you unmuted?
I've tried unmuted. Can you hear me?
Oh, great. Thank you, David. Do you want to ask your question yourself?
Cool.
I'll make it more of a conversation. Thank you.
No, that's fine. Thanks very much. I'm just, you may be aware, we've in New Zealand had one of our major hospitals has just had a ransomware attack, which has completely crippled it. So we're very aware of the risks in terms of security, but we don't know for sure. But the apparent way that the ransomware occurred is got into their system is via an email, and having been caught out by myself by such a thing just through a banking thing, I'm very sort of conscious of how that can easily happen. So I'm just wondering, I mean, I understand, of course, the risks with the Internet of Things and devices, but I just wonder if either of the speakers know just, what's the relative risk for either. I would think, unfortunately, that humans are probably more risky than devices, but yeah.
Yeah, so I'm happy to tackle that.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I think that is our general experience, that we are riskier than devices. But anyway, over to you, Saif. Yeah.
So, I deal with national security as an issue, as a way of looking at healthcare. And one of the first things that I'll say, and this is a philosophical one, but if you look at GCHQ and the NCSC here in the UK, it's important to shift away from the concept of the human as the weakest link, because also the human is the strongest link in all of this. Just as a philosophical viewpoint, I think is important to share. You will find that 99 out of 100 times the easiest way to get into a system is via email, is via phishing. That is still the best way to get in. And I've done simulation exercises where I can, someone like me can write very compelling emails, or I'm pretty confident you will click on what I write or the attachment or whatever it may be. I won't go into that. I don't want to give anyone any ideas, but it's actually not that difficult. And there are two ways to approach it. You can write a very sophisticated email and just target a few places, or you can write a really blanket, terrible email and hope 1 out of 100,000 clicks on it. That's still going to be the way in. But the way to understand the kill chain is that's only the beginning of the attack. That does, a medical device, if it has a vulnerability, as soon as an attacker gets in, they're looking for, where can I embed myself so I can be hidden? Where can I sit and conduct reconnaissance on the health system? It may be 2 hours of reconnaissance. It may be 300 days of reconnaissance. They are looking for different ways to embed themselves in the system, different ways to spread, the different ways to build their own resiliency so that they can't be caught out. So if you catch them in one area, they've already spread somewhere else. And that's where the interoperability of the IoT ecosystem in a hospital makes it that much more dangerous and that much more easy to completely take down multiple times over and over again. We see ransomware attacks at one health system. They implement their own people, processes, and new CISO, new technology. 6 months later, they're hit by another ransomware attack. So that's the way to understand it. Medical devices aren't necessarily a way in. They're a way to stay in and the way to scale. And that's the way I would look at it. And that's been certainly my experience.
David, if your question is in terms of relatively between the device and the human being, where do you tilt? I think it's a no-brainer answer. I would trust the device more than the human being, because the device at least follows rules. Human beings follow no rules. And it's human beings who cause all the deviations. So I think unless we educate, train, orient people in terms of what they should be doing, what they should be looking out for, how vigilant they should be, guided by good technology that can keep them safe, I would say the risk is more from the humans than the devices, because the variation always, statistically, your variation is caused more by the human behavior that is not probably well charted out, that causes that particular opening for a breach to happen. So it's the weakest link, and the weakest link is caused by a behavioral pattern. So I would say focus more on the human beings than the devices.
Okay, thank you, Arvind, and thank you, Said. David, any thoughts on that? Or you have? David, no, nothing back from David. Okay, let's move on to some other questions that we have, Saif and Arvind, from the participants. So here's one. Do you have any advice on the safe disposal of obsolete devices used in digital health, such as tablets, Android devices, and such like, as well as laptops, I guess, as well?
I mean, I think I'd probably hand over to Arvind on this a little bit more, but
Yeah.
The first point is you have to understand your policy. Do you own those devices? Are they corporate devices, enterprise devices, or have you employed some kind of bring your own device strategy? Because that makes life a lot more difficult, and it blurs the lines in terms of how you control the device and the ecosystem it lives in. That's question one. Question two, of course, is what is that device storing? And the way you decommission it and the way it connects to a network, it will play a big part in this. And then the third part, and this is for, I can't comment for in India, of course, but certainly in Europe and the United States, there are companies that specialize in the decommissioning and safe destruction of these devices that are accredited by government agencies that have to be regulated to do this. And I tend to advise, work with those companies. They know what they're doing.
Thank you, Saif. Arvind, you're a big organization across hundreds of settings and sites. Yeah, how do you manage your disposal?
I think it's essential to create a checklist, and devices will have to be disposed of for several reasons. One, they go out of work, they go out of warranty, they start malfunctioning, they are out of the technology levels, whatever be the case. First, I would say get them back into the factory settings. And by getting them back into the factory settings means that the device is back into its original manner in which you started using it. That means that you've done enough to remove the applications and the storage of data and the storage of the transient data. So it's just not about my application connects securely through a database but there might be, depending on whatever architecture is being followed, some transient storage information. And at the same time, there could be some secondary information that if a person who knows the subject can correlate and get some other information too. So get your device back into factory settings. And then, like what Dr. Saif mentioned, definitely, yes, work with those agencies. And I'm sure every local government in India, every local government has an e-waste policy and an e-waste disposal policy. So you obviously start getting into the larger aspect of environment safety and such like things, not damaging the future generations or other environmental aspects. So be mature and be responsible around that. So follow the guidelines of e-waste policies. If none exist, literally Google up any country's e-waste policy, take the essence of it. The essence of it would be the same, and then the regulatory guidelines would be dependent on the law of the land in whichever country you're looking at. Take the essence of it if you're not able to find one, and then make sure that you're being responsible about both the disposal and responsible about decommissioning from the content it was having to the factory setting and then putting it into the waste.
Great, thank you, Arvind. And I guess that's the same side for European. I noticed your links with the European Commission, so presumably there are European approaches to this as well in various countries.
It's to be honest, it's pretty standardized at this point. There is a nuance here, a nuance there, the name of the companies that we recommended, their certifications, but it's, as Arvind said, you need to have a standardized checklist, and then based on your geography, you identify who to work with to execute it. Great,
thank you. We just had a flashed question here before I move on to the next one. Oh, it's gone again. So let me just, it came up on my screen. So another question is, how do we decide which security application or software is the best? We're inundated with different commercial applications and different softwares from well-known companies, which I'm not going to mention now, but is there a formula for deciding which are the best ones, or should you do that individually, or should you just always stick to your employer's rule?
I want to declare an interest. Sorry, go ahead.
No, because obviously many people will have their home applications as well as their work applications, and it is always best to keep those completely separate, if at all possible.
Yeah, I want to declare an interest here, and this will be interesting from also Arvind's response. So obviously my company also sells security technology, and I'm very cynical of industry, because ever since WannaCry, every single security company in the world now has a banner in its website that says healthcare, but they, I'll call a spade a spade. They don't know anything about healthcare. It's just a market opportunity. And so what I always say is, I'd like to think if I'm having a cup of coffee with Arvind or any other healthcare provider, at least they see, oh, company X understands healthcare. They're built for healthcare. They work for healthcare. It's in their blood. Most companies, unfortunately, are not at that stage, even though they have a security product or application for healthcare. So for me, if I was speaking separately, I'd say, if you're interested in what a company is doing from a security perspective, interrogate them to see whether they actually understand what a clinical workflow is. Do they understand the organization of a hospital? Do they understand the policies of the health system that they want to operate in? Before you even get to the product and I'm sure the amazing AI, big data, all the buzzwords that they're going to throw at you. Do they actually know anything about healthcare? Then whether you'll have a decent relationship with them based on that conversation.
Okay, great, thank you.
My take on that is very interesting. Rather than suspect the company that is giving you the software or the solution, ask yourself if you know what you want. Because if a company is coming and selling you something that they are not qualified to sell, why did you buy it?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think look at it in terms of first, because there are several solutions, and several solutions are probably trending in the same direction. One could have a maturity on a particular topic and the other might be lesser mature and all that. But I think we will have to look at a total of what do we want? What is it that is our requirement of our levels of safety? What are we aspiring for? And to the question on whether it has to be a home or office or something like that, I'd say security is security. So there's no big difference between home or office, because each has its importance in its own realm of affairs. I'd say treat both with equal importance, with equal respect, and with equal suspicion.
Okay,
so
thank you.
That's
that's a philosophy for life, Arvind. Thank you very much. Okay. Now then, we've got time for one more question, and this might be actually the most interesting one. So it's, I'll read the question out, and then we'll discover what it really means when we start discussing it. How can techniques of mistake proofing be incorporated into handling complex medical devices by health workers? So, as human beings, we're complex. Our decision-making algorithms, our own algorithms, are very complex, and hence that's why we make a lot of mistakes. complex medical devices are complex by their nature, but as we heard earlier, they are rules-based, pretty much rule-based. So I'll go back to the question then. How can techniques of mistake proofing be incorporated into handling complex medical devices by healthcare workers? Arvind first or Saif first? I don't mind. Saif, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to speak purely as a clinician here.
Yeah.
If you're making a product and you describe it as a complex medical device, you've made a mistake. When I'm busy in the emergency room or I'm on call at 2 a.m. in the morning, I don't care how complex your device is. I need what I need to do my job. And my first job is to get ready for surgery or to see a patient in the emergency room or whatever it may be. So your user interface, your way of presenting data better be as simple as humanly possible. The underlying engineering could be Nobel Prize winning. I really don't care. So, you know, if we've got to the stage where we have to do a lot of, as you described, mistake proofing, because it's an overly complex product at the interface with me as a clinician, then frankly, in my view, the manufacturer has failed. And I'm going to pause there.
Very good, very good. Well, good segue there, Saif. Okay, Arvind.
Completely agree with Saif. It's not about how advanced the technology is. It has to be a simple user experience. A simple user experience that is not confusing, because in healthcare, the situations are going to be charged with a lot of emotion, whether you're in the ER or the ICU or even in a normal medical setting. It is going to be a little charge setting emotionally for people and for the number of people that would be taken care of. So keep the usability simple. The second aspect is, this is the place where we can start exploring AI and ML algorithms to start popping up point of care alerts and reminders that not only couple the information that is being dealt with at that instant in time, but also the intelligence that goes by building that whole storehouse of data and knowledge over a period of time. That will give a better way of looking at how you're reacting to it. So guide the clinician, guide the provider at point of care with relevant insights and keeping it simple at point of care.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I hope that answers the question for the questioner. So we are now at 09:58 on my particular device. So I'm going to take this opportunity, I think, where there are no more questions coming through that I can identify. I'd like to thank you all, the participants, everyone, for joining this webinar today, and for your kind attention and listening to our excellent speakers. And so thank you also to our speakers, Dr. Saif and Arvind, who have provided a really fascinating session, but also a session that I think is asking more questions, which is always the element that is really important for us to maintain our curiosity and continue to strive to learn from each other. So thank you very much, Saif and Arvind. We'll now close the session on time, but please keep an eye on your emails and on social media for details of the next Leading Health Systems Network webinar, which will be held in July, late July. But I think also what we've discovered again today is that the need for continuing conversations and collaboration across our world, not just through Zoom or Teams or Google Meets or whatever, but really aiming to start to meet up again, hopefully soon, hopefully if not this year, next year, so we can really continue to have these conversations in live and try to build that human interaction again into our daily lives, which many people are missing. So may I thank everybody for their attendance. I'd also really like to thank again Nikki O'Brien, our Research Policy Fellow at IGHI and LHSN, who always brings these webinars together with great speakers. So thank you again, Nikki. Thank you, Saif. Thank you, Arvind. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And we'll now close the webinar. Thank you very much.